Welcome to my city, Chicago, everybody. Okay, as a Chicagoan here, born and raised, I think I could prove that by my accent. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover today. But I could tell you how one of the stories ends. We're talking about rookie mistakes. But just to tell you the end, I covered some local politician who started in this neighborhood. State senator, I wasn't around much for that, I was in Washington, then this person was a senator. And then if you want to know how that story ends, because I don't know if everybody quite understands exactly where we are, walk out of this hotel, turn right, walk 3 blocks, and you will see under construction the Obama Presidential Center. So when in the future everybody in this room goes to see it, you will know that you saw it when it was just being built. But it's kind of cool to see it literally almost at ground zero. And now on to the main program. Okay, we're going to lean into the practical here. I want everybody to come away, and this is our job. If they don't get 10 practical pieces of advice, then we're going to have to meet everybody afterwards to keep going until we get to 10. Okay, everybody, that's a deal? Whoever gets, listen to what we say, when we get to 10, we're done. Because who gives you 11 pieces of advice? No one. Okay, so buckle up. Especially if you're a local reporter in a swing state, you will get a good taste of what it's like to cover a presidential campaign. I want to focus on what we're doing in presidential and congressional, but I want to start out with one of the most important things to remember. I'm going to quote, as you may know, the Panic at the Discos, great group. Their song, High Hopes. It was the walk-up song for Mayor Pete. So as we start this, please remember this could be takeaway number 1. Are you ready? Mama said, don't give up. It's a little complicated. And with that, Liz Smith, what is the best piece of advice you have ever given to a rookie campaign reporter?
The best piece of advice I've given and that I would give is to always, always, always take the opportunity to sit down with a campaign staff and especially a candidate. I worked for Mayor Pete, now Secretary Pete, in 2020, and I cannot tell you the number of reporters that I reached out in the early days of the campaign and said, hey, Mayor Pete's coming through town, through DC, through New York, through Des Moines, through Manchester, whatever. Do you have time to sit down with him? And so many of them thought, oh my God, who the heck is this? I'm too good, I'm not gonna sit down with this guy.
Say his name again?
Yeah, exactly. And then of course, flash forward 6 months, and they are kicking themselves. And they literally told me that. And so I think it goes to show you that, a candidate today who could be maybe last in the polls or not that compelling, tomorrow could be a household name or someone who is at the top of the polls. So always, always, always take that opportunity to sit down with a candidate and also their staff.
That's a really good piece of advice in the sense of also, a lot of reporters start out as embeds on the campaign trail. Your job, CNN has a ton of these, is to follow one candidate around and basically transcribe every single thing they say. You memorize their speeches, you memorize the candidates' walk-up songs, and to the point of you never know what that candidate is ultimately going to do. Maybe they won't be president or whatever their goal, their office is they're seeking in that cycle, but they may go on to be in the cabinet, they may go on to be the vice president, as was the case with Pence. And with Pence, it really helped the embeds who were on his campaign, because look how instrumental of the role that he ultimately played. He wasn't just any vice president, of course, as we all saw how that culminated on January 6th, but the reporters who had followed him and developed relationships with his team that followed him into the White House really had a leg up to a degree to the people who were only focusing on Trump, because then they could talk to the Pence people in the vice president's office, and that was just as good as White House sourcing as a lot of people who had covered Trump.
So, Priscilla, this is going to be a question I'm going to stand a little bit, only because I get restless. Don't mind me. Priscilla, this is a synthesis, what I'm going to ask, of some of the questions some of you had turned in beforehand. So, Priscilla, and you were an embed, and you bring that experience to the table. Is there any rookie mistake you learned from and could have avoided. So you're the time machine.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, I was actually an embed on Mayor Pete Buttigieg's campaign, and the biggest thing that my bosses told me when I got hired was knowing when you have news. And I was like, that's never gonna happen to me. I'm never gonna miss the news. And then he did an interview about the Supreme Court with Cosmopolitan, and he made a comment about former Justice Kennedy. And I did not have the background knowledge and context to understand the importance of this comment. And so I sent out my note, no news made, went on with my day, and I get an email, thankfully, from my senior editor who was like, hey, this is news. And so I had to very quickly figure out what was going on and sent out an updated note saying, hey, this is getting some traction, so I just wanted to let you all know, this is what happened. And so I think you can try as much as you want with obviously the background knowledge and the context that you bring to the job to not miss news, but that may happen. And I think in that event, that's why you have bosses and a whole political unit and team behind you that understand some of the historical context that you may miss and can hopefully catch that. So I would say rely on those people. And, obviously as you go through the campaign, you'll build more of your background knowledge around things that you may not be as familiar with, but definitely rely on those people.
So let me just ask you this. Looking back, and let's say you didn't have the backup of that team, is there something you would have done different?
Yeah, I think I would have taken a little bit more time to look into the people that he was talking about and the comments that he was making, if I didn't know who this person was, just to understand, oh, this is a somewhat conservative justice, and he's saying he wants more people like that on the Supreme Court, or however, how it's being perceived. So I think just taking the time to do a little bit more of that research instead of pushing the note out so quickly.
Okay, so takeaway number 1, research, research, research to know what you don't know, which is always good, by the way. I'm 100 years into the business, and I still don't know what I don't know. So, Kaitlan, anything new at work?
No.
What's the best piece of advice that you would give to a reporter who's starting out?
I have a lot. I actually love what you said, because I do think when reporters are starting out, you do not know how to look for news, and you are a little, you're just trying to keep up with the job itself. I think a big part of that is reading a lot, making sure you're reading the front pages of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, reading the political newsletters that come out, whichever ones, because that also helps you stay on top of it. And one thing I really benefited from when I joined the White House Press Corps was just befriending the people in the White House Press Corps and watching and learning from them and having conversations with them. If we went into a gaggle with President Trump or with someone, and to really listen, to learn to listen for the news, because the news sneaks up on you. You don't always know it's news. There can be very mundane events like an Easter egg roll at the White House, and Trump comes over and makes big news. You never know when your candidate is going to make news. This is a really small one, but it was actually very helpful to us, especially in the Trump White House, as you know, which was ABC. Always be charging, because you never know when a breaking event is going to happen. And if your phone's on 30%, you're going to be totally in trouble. And that was actually, it seems so small and obvious, but it really isn't. And I can't tell you how many times we'd go outside for a Trump departure and he'd speak for 50 minutes, and people's phones would die while they were out there tweeting and trying to get the news back to their newsrooms, and they'd have to wait and go back in. And it's so small, but it was actually an instrumental part of being prepared.
Actually, everybody, this is takeaway number 2. This is seriously the most important thing if any of us could ever help you. Bring those extra chargers with. It is nothing worse. Well, actually, having to go to the bathroom on the bus is pretty bad when you're stuck. But in all seriousness, you have got to be charged all the time, and you just have got to have the discipline of having the extra power booster in your pocket. That's why if you look at the gizmos and the white boxes, the takeaway 3 here, take the white box, because those are portable chargers for you in there. Professional tip. Charge them up. Keep it with you at all times. An emergency, call 911. So Liz, you're the other side. What is the best way for a rookie reporter who you don't know and have never heard of to how do you become a source?
Yeah, so I want to tack on just one thing, and I'll do it quickly because Lynn is one of the few people in life that truly terrifies me, is if you are covering a campaign, especially if you're covering a presidential campaign, I would really, really recommend to go back and read reporting of past campaigns or books about past campaigns, whether they're written by reporters or operatives like Liz Smith's Any Given Tuesday, because it can provide you really important context. And there's that old saying, history doesn't rhyme, but it often repeats itself. And every cycle, there are sort of rhythms that you fall into and stories and storylines, and I think it can really help to see how these things were handled in the past. Now, how do you develop a source? This is something that Lynn and I had talked about before, but you're not going to develop a source. You're not going to develop a close relationship with me if you're just sending me an email saying, I need a comment on this issue by 5 p.m., thanks. Because all you're gonna get from me is just like a standard one sentence reply that's very canned, has been approved by a million people, probably won't give you much in the way of insight into my thinking, my candidate's thinking, any of that. So what you really wanna try to do is to set up drinks with them, set up lunch with them, talk with them on the phone, get to know them. Because one, if you can build a relationship that's based on trust, it's a two-way street, and they're going to be more willing to share details with you and a little more color, for instance, about why a candidate's views are the way they are, things they're concerned about, things that they're thrilled about, maybe things that are coming down the pike. But if you have a relationship where you can have a phone conversation, you're going to get a lot more out of someone like me. You're going to get a lot more texture about a position. We can go on background, we can go off the record. And I just think that the depth of knowledge that you obtain from those types of relationships are a lot better than anything you will ever obtain over text or email.
Pro tip number 3. Get phone numbers, use the phone. I know it might seem like I'm talking about vinyl to some of you, but everything cannot be done in a text. And if you deal with the delicate stuff, and if you and your sauce want to dance around what's on background, what's off the record, because everybody has a different thought on that, that is not something you go back and forth on in text messages, because you just don't do it that way. But speaking of Any Given Tuesday, which I recommend you read because it also tells you about Liz's dating life, here's what she talked about. That Ted Strickland, when she worked for him in Ohio, he reminded her to always think not just of the reporter, but of the person I was talking to. Who are they? Where are they from? What makes them tick? Liz, why is that important?
Well, again, and that's part of the two-way street, right? Between a relationship between a candidate and their staff and a reporter. And I think it's really important to understand that you're not dealing with cardboard cutouts when you're talking to a candidate. Sometimes there are definitely candidates who can come across as cardboard cutouts. Do not get me wrong. But you are oftentimes dealing with people who are, they do have real lives. They have families, they have faith systems, they have life experiences that color who they are. And understanding all of that can sort of give you an into sort of how to speak with them, how to relate to them, and find new angles maybe that other reporters haven't found. If your only relationship with a candidate is asking them about polls or asking them about whatever the issue du jour is, you're not going to get very far. And so I think it is really important to try to get to know the person that you're working with, that you're covering, and from my side, to get to know the reporter. Because if my candidate's talking with a reporter, I want that candidate to be able to have a deeper conversation with them. Maybe ask them about their favorite sports team. Maybe ask them how their kids are doing. Maybe ask them how their sick mom is doing. Things like that. And I think it allows you to develop a much closer, trusting, nuanced relationship.
So Kaitlan, we didn't get from you what is your biggest rookie mistake as you look back?
Actually, this is a really good topic because I always say this when I speak to students who are in school for journalism, who have just graduated. I did not learn how to develop sources in college, and I was a journalism and political science major, and it just wasn't something we talked about in depth. And I remember when I got my job at CNN and I was covering the Trump White House, I reached out to an old professor of mine, and I just asked for help. I was like, how do I develop a source? What does this even look like? Because I'd kind of made this mistake of I would get people's numbers or their emails or see them in person, and I would kind of treat it as a moment to get a quote from them or ask them something on the record, and that's not the way to start, because I think you need to develop a sense of trust with this person first, because they're people too, and like Liz said, they have families, they have interests, they have jobs, and the two of you, even though you're not on the same side and you have a naturally tense relationship at times, depending on, of course, which candidate you're covering and what that operation looks like, you have a deeper understanding and a shared understanding of what each other is going through in a way that really no one else does. This is something that happened in the Trump White House. Officials would talk to us a lot because they felt like we were the only people who really understood what they were going through, working with Trump every day. And while they had a different, perspective of it, they were working for him, were covering him. They felt like reporters who covered Trump were the only people who really understood what it was like inside that West Wing at sometimes. And so I called this professor of mine and he said, just treat them as a person, start a conversation with them, and not necessarily like a friendship, but to a degree a relationship like that. And I did that, and it completely changed everything for me, and it changed my approach to meeting people inside the White House. And even if they would scream at you later on, or you have disagreements over the way you covered something, they would still know that you're coming at it from a good place. And I think that's a really important basis for developing sources. But that is the biggest thing I think that reporters need to learn before they go out and become reporters. And I don't think that they always get a good basis of source development.
Well, part of that may be is that people have different paths to politics. Some throwbacks, perhaps like me, I started covering a suburban government, then Cook County government, and boy, I didn't know what I was doing in that one. But my path to politics started when I realized in covering Cook County government, how'd they get here? And it's all full of politics. But before I forget, and we're going to get back to mistakes and advice because we need a lot more takeaways here. Not all of you are going to be embeds, but Priscilla, being a recent embed, did have this grueling life. What is I need you to be takeaway 4. What is the takeaway on keeping sane when you're on this kind of 24/7 campaign trail?
Yes, that is very hard because you wake up in the morning and you're immediately checking Twitter and stuff to see what did I miss that happened, what do I need to send out a note on, and it gets very busy. I think you have to kind of find the time to do something for yourself. So I would find a window of time where I could go on a run, or I would try to walk to get food from the hotel instead of driving, as just as a way to get some exercise, because that can be really hard sometimes, getting to the gym or getting that in. And then also something that a number of the Iowa embeds did was get a massage subscription, like the ones where you can find in any state in the country. And so anytime we could find an hour where we could maybe silence our phones, we would try to go in for that massage to keep a little bit of peace amid a lot of chaos. But that became very hard once the primaries got going. So do it early.
So is it a deep touch? Now, moving on. So Liz.
It should have been.
Does sucking up help?
A little flattery can go a long way, but I think, just like in life, you can see through suck-ups and you can see through all of that, and you don't want to be so shameless because that ultimately ruins your personal credibility with people. But rather than sucking up, what I would recommend is being intellectually curious, caring about what campaign staff, what candidates care about. This sort of gets back to what we were talking about before. And more so than that, it's important not to be a jerk. Sorry, I had to censor myself there. And sometimes, the campaign trail and covering the campaign trail and covering politics sometimes can be really frustrating, can be really tiring. It feels like you're running into a brick wall. And, your temper can get out of control and you can sort of, lose your stuff on someone. I think it's really important to treat other people with respect and understand that sort of stuff can come back to haunt you. But otherwise, I generally just would advise, people on my side, reporters, to try to treat each other with respect and, try to develop whatever sort of friendships you can along the way, and that will go a long way in developing a trusting source relationship.
Can I add to that, though? I do think you should always be nice, be polite, be cordial. But also, I think sometimes when reporters are just starting out, you're timid. And you spend a lot of time, especially if you are an embed with this campaign, with this staff, and you're going to see them every single day, and maybe you don't want to rock the boat. I think you should always make sure that you're being fearless. Make sure you know what you're talking about, you know what you're asking about, but you're not working with this campaign, you're covering them. So don't be afraid to challenge them or push back on something, or maybe ask a question if they've told you, no questions at this moment. You're a reporter, you can ask a question when you want to, and I think that's a big part, is knowing that you do have the authority to speak up and to ask questions and challenge the premise of something that candidate is saying.
Now, start thinking of your questions, because in a few minutes, we're going to have questions. So another takeaway, just because a press person says no questions doesn't mean you have to stop.
It encourages me to ask questions. I think that's when you definitely ask a question, because then I'm like, well, now that you told me I can't, I'm going to ask a question.
Because that's a one-way deal. I was just at an event in Washington last week where somebody, I didn't even know who the hell she was, it was 4 mayors from big cities are there, and someone says, you're only going to ask on-topic questions. Really? And, the questions end when the principals say it ends, not the press people. Now, Liz, I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but when you say no, but when you talked about being timid, so again, in the book, The First Tuesday, here is what Liz Smith said about embeds. It pits 20-something reporters against hardened campaign veterans and candidates. And it sets the stage for what you call the Stockholm Syndrome dynamic, where young reporters are rarely acknowledged by the candidates they cover and often verbally abused by staffers, start to feel dependent, that any scrap thrown their way is a gift. How can you do that to people?
Well, I want to make clear, and I think Priscilla can vouch for this. This was not our approach on Pete's campaign, and we ran a campaign that was really based on respecting the media and giving basically as much access as we could to the media, because we understood that for someone who was a complete unknown, that access was our friend, and that was the only way that Pete was going to build the name ID to get out there. But I have seen this with other campaigns, and the one campaign, I think the campaign I was really talking about there was the Romney campaign in 2012. Mitt Romney gave them very, very little access, and anytime any of the embeds who were traveling with Romney, challenged him or asked him a question or asked questions after they were told no more questions, they would sort of get banished to the back of the plane, or told, you're screwed, you're done, you're never going to get access again. And so it does sometimes create this warped incentive system where the people who are covering the candidate then are sort of timid because they feel like they're dependent on these relationships to get news for their outlets. And it's a tough situation to be in, but I think it's imperative to what Kaitlan said, to always still push through. And it doesn't mean being a jerk. It doesn't mean being out of line with the candidate, but it does mean, understanding that you are there for a job, and that job is to report the news, get the truth, get the big stories out there to people. And sometimes it will mean that you're at the back of the plane, or, not invited out to drinks with the campaign staff.
Yeah, and I think that's totally important and spot on about having your agency even as a younger, perhaps less experienced reporter. And I think the other thing in terms of relationships with the campaigns, but also with your fellow reporters, because there were times whenever we would all get together and say, okay, this isn't acceptable, we need to figure this out. If it's going to your news organization and saying we need to have a larger conversation about this. And so there are some ways to handle that, but also I learned a ton from the veteran reporters, particularly the print reporters that were with us, about how to handle some of those situations. I'll never forget being in a situation where someone wasn't letting us out of the press pen, and this wasn't a person that we had seen before, and we're all like, okay, this is not acceptable, we need to figure this out. And this veteran print reporter was very calm, and he was like, okay, what is your name? Who is your manager? And let me just write down what you're telling us. And that person very quickly went to go get the press secretary, who was like, no, it's all good, you guys can get out. And so I think it's learning from your colleagues and sometimes figuring out how to navigate those situations and maybe find a bit more empowerment in those situations through sort of your colleagues as well.
Are people beginning to line up? I don't see you. Come on. Don't make us feel bad. And it is when you are threatened. So before we do questions, this will be my final bit of advice. I don't know, we're on takeaway 6, so we have to up the ante here. What, Liz will have a different view on this. To a rookie reporter who is threatened with being cut off for whatever reason, Kaitlan, what is the best thing to do?
Remain calm. I think often, this is obviously a reference, this happened to me inside the Trump White House, when I had asked a question that Trump did not want to be asked about his former attorney, Michael Cohen, in the Oval Office, and then they banned CNN from going to an event in the Rose Garden later that afternoon, which obviously you can't do. It was a clear punishment, and they said as much, so it was pretty clear. I think one thing that the way CNN handled it was really gracious, which was we didn't make CNN the story because it wasn't about me, it wasn't about CNN, but it was just access at large and what that looks like. And if they decide, well, today we didn't like this question, so you're not gonna come to this event, they could do it to someone else the next day. And so I think that is why we went public with it and made it clear that this is what the White House was doing. They were roundly rebuked for doing so. It caused quite a solidarity among the press corps to say this is not something that's acceptable. That's another thing, that you do have power in numbers as reporters. When you all go together to a candidate, to a White House, to an office, you do have strength in numbers. And so I think for you personally, it's important to remain calm. Don't make the story about yourself. It's not personal. But understand that you do need to stand up for press access, because it can seem like something small in the moment, but it could add up to bigger things over time.
Now, I know you two want to add to it, but we're not going to. Bear with me, because we do want to take questions from the audience. And that, Pat Murphy, it's you.
I'm Patricia Murphy. I'm the political columnist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thank you for an amazing panel so far. I'm one of many once rookie reporters who learned everything I know from Lynn Sweet. Lynn, you've worked with a lot of rookies. What are the big mistakes you've seen that rookies should avoid?
Well, it's the same ones I did. Being naive, figuring out how to get access, and writing, and not figuring out who to talk to when the people you want to talk to won't talk to you. And it just takes homework. And the other thing is, because we have other questions, and thank you for asking, you've got to be master of the subject. If you think you cover politics, doesn't let you off the hook for not understanding that it's politics, public policy, and press that all intersect, and it's finding that sweet spot. And that's hard. I'm still looking for it some days. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Hey, I'm Kit Maher with CNN. I'm an embed, and I was curious, you spoke about, asking a question when they say no questions. I'm curious if you have any strategies in the rope line or in gaggles to get your question answered by that specific candidate.
A lot of it is knowing the candidate, because sometimes they're people and they have tics, and if you're an embed, you're with them all the time. We did this with Trump. I remember Kristen Welker from NBC and I, at the Easter egg roll, we were like, how are we gonna get him to come over here? Because we wanted to ask him, I don't even remember what the news of the day was that day, but we wanted to ask him, we knew if we started out with that question, he'd hear us, but he'd keep walking. So Welker and I decided that she was gonna ask him what his Easter plans were, and that I would then follow up with the question that we wanted to do, because we knew that would be the news of the day if we got him to talk on it. So she said, Mr. President, what are your Easter plans? And he heard the question, heard that it was friendly, and he came over, and then I followed up with the other question. And we couldn't believe it worked after. Like, we just kind of looked at each other. But it was teamwork. Like, we truly knew that if we both asked the tough question that we wanted to ask, he may not come over. And so I think that's part of it, is knowing the candidate. We knew Trump at the time, how he would react. Same thing with President Biden. There are certain things that he would ignore, certain things he would respond to. And often, if you can get them to respond to one question, they'll stick around for your other fellow reporters' questions. So it's important that you strategize and work together, and not just this cacophony of voices as well.
Now, the timer just went back up to 20 minutes, and I don't think we have another 20 minutes.
I have another question. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I know we have questions. So if one of the people could just tell me, are we at 2 minutes now? Because I have 20 minutes and 21 seconds. That can't be right, is it? Okay, your next, what?
20 minutes.
It is right, okay. Okay, great, your question.
Hi, I'm Zaria Oates. I'm with ABC 24 in Memphis. I'm one of those 20-somethings reporters you were talking about earlier, and I'm wondering, in local news specifically, how do you handle your local news managers not feeling like something's a news story when you know that it is? You've talked to people who think it matters, but they're like, it's not the lead, it's not the top story, but it is once you get it. How do you deal with that?
Priscilla.
Yeah, I can chat about that a little bit. I was in local news in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina before transitioning on. I mean, I think it's just a continued conversation and figuring out, okay, well, what are you looking for in this story? For what would make it news to you? And like, okay, can I find that character or what you're looking for? Or if it's just continuing to push and say, this is a really big story, like here is the update that I have on what's going on with this. Here's this new character that I found that I really think embodies like what we're trying to get at here. And you have to just be persistent. But I think also understanding like what their concerns or reservations might be about the story is like helpful for figuring out how to cultivate it or maybe change it to meet the needs and come to some sort of compromise where you're able to tell that story and they're also getting whatever they need out of the coverage.
And I just want to add one thing. And one thing that I saw, especially on the Mitt Romney campaign, and it's, again, an anecdote I write about in my book, Any Given Tuesday, but it is really instructive, which is that Mitt Romney would sort of avoided sit-downs with national media, but he did a lot with local media. And a lot of presidential candidates will sort of, once you get to the general election, avoid sit-downs with national media, but do a ton with local media. Because, if you're in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, the local reporters there that's gonna be where voters are consuming their news. So in that perch, you have a great opportunity to break news. And what I would say is to make sure that you are aware of that opportunity and take it. Don't just ask about the polls. Don't just ask about the horse race. Get them on the record on, a hot button issue that maybe no national reporter has had the ability to get to them on. And if you can do that, your story can go from, yes, your local market and trickle up to the front page of the New York
Good
Times.
point. How many people here are in swing states? Okay, so that means you have something I've never had in my career, which is the ability to be sought after by presidential campaigns. In fact, I would like some swing state reporters to think of a good question or to strategize among yourselves and network, because you are the people that a lot of the campaigns want. So the difference between someone like me in a blue state and a buddy of mine who is in Wisconsin is that I never got, would you like to talk to the president today? Maybe, I don't know. Would you want to talk to this person, that luminary? Do you want to sit down? You name it. It's like going to an ice cream store and picking your flavor. The amount of focus on it. So in a swing state, Liz, if you could get with more specificity, especially for reporters here who don't know what's coming, what is coming, and what could they do to, I know Liz has this point that you want to ask the question, a big national question. But as someone who is rooted and committed to covering the intersection of anything that has anything to do with Chicago, I would also feel obliged to ask a Chicago question as if I do have a national. So what is the advice? Who are the swing staters again? Raise your hand. What states are you from? Wisconsin. Oh my God. Okay, Liz, what should a rookie reporter in a swing state who's never done the primary thing before know? We need about 3 takeaways, please.
Done the primary thing or just done the
Primary thing.
the primary
How
thing?
they will be wooed and maybe
Yeah. Oh,
spun
yeah.
and seduced and
Yes, of course.
dazzled and
So you might think that maybe you take a backseat to the big names in national media, and that's just not the case. Because smart campaigns understand that if you want to win a primary, you got to cultivate those relationships with reporters in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, now Michigan and Georgia. And so you have a special power that national reporters don't, because your news is going straight to the voters that a candidate needs to win a primary or to win a general election. So one, you have that power. Two, so you should do the same things that national reporters do. Make sure to reach out to the campaigns, get to know the folks, talk to them on the phone, and always, 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 if that candidate is in your state, whether they're well-known or not, make sure to sit down with them, because who knows? Again, Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't know if I pronounced his last name correctly, he might be in last place right now, but I'm sure at some point he'll have his 15 minutes of fame. So go sit down with him, get to know him, and then when he has 15 minutes of fame, you'll have, copy to run with, or you'll have that relationship where you can give him a call. And then the third thing is, an interesting thing that I found with local reporters is that in your own states, there's always interesting news going on. Overreach from
Georgia.
Yeah, exactly, right? And in Georgia, right, there's a big storyline right now about, the split in the Republican Party and some overreach by some Republicans in the party there. And oftentimes these local storylines can tell you a lot about national politics as well. And if you're in Wisconsin, you had the Supreme Court race. And so I would try to get, or in a lot of states now, you've got abortion laws being signed, restrictions on LGBTQ rights. So to make sure to ask candidates about those issues, get them on the record on that, because that then can make national news, because that can tell you about where they fit into a larger conversation, a national conversation, and then it can lead to a domino effect. Okay, well, if they're on the record on it, then this candidate needs to be on the record on it, and you can really have an impact on the news cycle that way.
So Priscilla and Kaitlan, how did you, again, especially to be helpful to the reporters in swing states that might not know how the magic happens, how did you develop? You talked a little bit about sources, but Priscilla, you're on the road. You can't always depend on your desk or your buddies to help you. How did you develop sources?
Yeah, and I totally could have been better at this when I was a rookie, but I think to the point that Liz made early on, so I was originally based in Iowa. I was supposed to cover Iowa. And the first thing we did when we got there in June was start setting up coffee and meetings with all of the campaigns and all of their Iowa people. And the conversation was about like the candidate and the campaign, but it was also just an interest in learning about them. What is your background? Like, what did you do before this? And I think like having those initial conversations are very important, and it gives you a baseline that you can sort of refer back to when you are talking to them. And I think beyond that, a lot of times it was just calling to check in. Like, yes, there will be times when you have to send the email or the call and say, hey, I need a response to this, or like, can you confirm this? But also it's just calling to say, hey, I was just calling to check in. Like, what's on you guys' radar for this week? Anything I should be like keeping an ear out for, an eye out for? And sometimes you just call at the opportune moment and they're like, well, actually, do you want this exclusive? So I think it's keeping a relationship and connection. And that definitely gets harder as things get busier, and depending on if you're covering a state where you're sort of covering half a dozen different candidates, or if you're on one candidate in particular. And it's also not just building relationships with like the campaign staff, but also like, can you connect with any donors? Can you connect with any strategists and people who aren't on the payroll and can maybe talk a little bit more freely with you about certain things? And so, yeah, I think it's, and definitely using the phone, like picking up the phone. I was very big on that.
That's a really good note on follow-up, because that's a huge part of it. I called a person one time in the Trump White House, just out of the blue, to check in. And they were like, yes, I did have lunch with the president today, and he said blah, blah, blah. Like, they thought I was calling to ask if they had lunch with Trump, and I had no idea that this person had lunch with Trump. So that's a really big part of it. I think the other thing is it's not magic necessarily, it's just doing the work. By being there and being at all of these campaign stops and going to a lot of events, even the ones that aren't super interesting or the best parts of it or seem like super captivating or leading the headlines, just doing the work and being at these events and putting in the time will also pay off in dividends for you. There were so many nights where I was at the White House really late, 10 o'clock at night or something like that, when Trump got COVID. Moments like that where you're just in the right place at the right time, not because you know anything's happening, you just happen to be there because you're always there.
And I was just gonna, sorry, one more thing, because I think sometimes as a less experienced journalists, it can be like, okay, what do I talk about them? Like, oh my God, Liz Smith just walked in. What do I talk to her about? And so one thing for me is like, outside of the day-to-day of covering, okay, what is the news of the day? I need to comment on this. I was always trying to think of like, okay, what's some sort of enterprise piece that I want to be working on in the background? And it's like, oh, you know, I want to do something on his ed policy or her belief on, you know, how the Supreme Court should look. Oh, this is a perfect time to go chat them up about like that, or like this thing that I'm noticing here in Iowa and talking to voters. And so I think too, just like always having a question that again isn't just like, oh, can I get a comment on this? Can I get a comment on that? But that like allows for a deeper conversation about something that they may be very passionate about wanting to talk to you about.
One of the things, I don't know what number we're up to on takeaways, if you're trying to figure out the who's who in the campaign, when you're at an event, walk around and discern, and you do this through your gut, who looks like a staffer. And just go there. Hi, I'm Lynn Sweet from the Sun-Times. Who are you? And it sounds obnoxious, but that kind of comes with the territory. Oh, you look important. Who are you? And then you just say, oh, I went to high school with Pete. Oh, okay, what's your name? And then you file it away. You never know what you never know. And when you look at, to follow up on our campaign disclosure, I read them like a steamy novel before I go to bed. And when you look, forget receipts some days, and you look at disbursements and you see who the campaign hired, that's how you will find out the things that somebody may not volunteer, not out of malice. You know, if you ask Liz who are the big shots in the campaign, she might not say, well, my direct mail vendor is, just because she doesn't, you know, that there's a lot of things. You may find actually, if you're covering local races, you also want to see if any local strategists are hired. You may know this way months in advance before the campaign maybe hits you in the face. So I would look at disbursements all the time. Are we at 7 now in pro tips? I hope we're doing well. So I do see, are we at 10? Well, we're done. No, we still have a few minutes left, and I want more people at the microphones. Ma'am, please give me a question.
Hi, I'm Emily Fannin at a local TV station for CBS in Milwaukee, battleground state. I wanted to ask about, of course, in our job as political reporters, we piss off campaigns, both sides, right? But oftentimes I feel like I run into where I'm getting shut out, you'll never get an interview ever again, or you're removed from a press release. How do you rebuild those relationships, and how do you go about, and is it worth it? Of course, you still want to have to follow the candidate, but just what's your advice on that?
It's tough because you don't want to treat them favorably just so they give you access. Obviously, that's like the worst thing. One of the worst things you could do as a reporter is being accused of being like an access journalist. But you also want to maintain a good relationship with them. And I think that it's naturally tense because you don't always see eye to eye on things. I mean, this is something, I laugh about this now with people that who worked in the Trump White House that I still speak with now, who are a lot happier to talk to me now than they were when they were actually working in the White House. But it's a tough thing to navigate. I think always you should err on the side of the coverage is what's important and making sure that you're able to get that. And if they try to shut you out, you know, you just have to work around it, I think. And if you're kicked off the press release, have someone else in your organization sign up for it with a different email or try to get that. Because I do think that's a big part of it. The one thing that I also think rookie reporters, a mistake that they would make just naturally is, you think the press secretary is your best contact or the communications director. I've never found that to be true. Oftentimes I've had probably the most tense relationship with a press secretary, and often if you go to other political strategists or campaign managers or someone who's known the candidate for a long time, as long as they know that you're coming from a good place, that you're fair, that you may not always agree, but that you are working in the best interest of your reporting, you can develop a relationship and work around it in that way. You know, I basically never spoke to the press office except to request comment in the end of the Trump White House because they just did not want to work with us. But we talked to a ton of people inside the West Wing, so we knew what was going on, and then we'd go to them for a request for comment, obviously to be fair and whatnot. But yeah, going through the press office isn't always the best route, so sometimes it's better to work around that and be creative.
So Liz, have you ever just cut off a reporter, and if so, how did they get back in?
No, I don't think so. So I was asked that question. You know, sometimes you'll have a disagreement, whatever, but I actually think that's a pretty counterproductive thing because as a keep going back to it, it's a two-way street. And if you cut off a reporter, then that means you're poisoning a relationship with them, potentially poisoning a relationship with that outlet. And, you're going to need that reporter one day. So I think I know people on my side of the aisle do that, and I think it's a really stupid, inadvisable thing to do.
So this is a takeaway, by the way, that candidates come and go, but operatives and donors remain the same. Another pro tip, especially for swing state reporters, get to know the donors because they aren't part of a campaign. They're independent operators, and they may be kind enough to tell you things because they are an early warning system because candidates in swing states also come in to do fundraising. And so you want that. Also, another pro tip, when someone says there's a fundraiser, you need a copy of the invitation because the invitation will list the co-hosts, and the co-hosts are other possible sources. Your question.
Hi, I'm Dan Vach. I'm with Route 15. We cover state governments around the country. My question is, if you don't have the luxury of being an embed with a major candidate or statewide candidate, how do you get them off your talking points when they usually give you a limited amount of time, if you have a substantive question about some of the things that they were talking about earlier today, like healthcare or education? How do you get sort of the trust to actually get something that you might be able to use that hasn't been said a million times?
Liz, even though you would think instinctively it should be a reporter who answers, I think, Liz, you know the tricks.
Yeah. Ask them questions that they haven't been asked before. Priscilla probably remembers this from the bus. There was one day where, and Pete generally loved, so we ended up doing recreating John McCain's Straight Talk Express on the campaign. And people said we were crazy, and, I probably am a little bit, but it was a great way for Pete to interact with reporters. But we found, early on that there was one day where after every stop, the only question Pete got was about impeachment. And he got really frustrated. And I was like, guys, there are other issues in the news, right? And so if you just ask the same questions over and over again, you're not going to get to know a candidate. You're not going to get an interesting answer. So think about things that they've probably never been asked before, even if it's a weird thing. Because one, if you started an interview maybe with a more personal question about them, or maybe with a more quirky question about them, that might get them to let down their guard. But also, don't be afraid to ask some off-the-wall questions. And that's where you'll get to see the real candidate come out. And because either they'll be able to answer it, and if they can't answer it and freeze up, that means they probably don't really have what it takes.
Okay, so reducing that, and because where the countdown clock is coming, we have the last two questioners. I'm going to reduce this to 3 words that Liz said, and another takeaway, if nothing else, pave new ground.
Yeah.
Journalistically sound, quirky, not puffy, pave new ground. Think of a question that no matter the answer, you don't want it to be yes or no, it gives you something you could use to write about. Ma'am, your question.
And can I also just quickly say, know what the talking points are ahead of time. They say them nonstop, so you can already anticipate what they're going to say and develop a follow-up. Well, Kevin McCarthy, what are you gonna, you're saying cut X $1 million. Well, what does that actually look like on defense spending or something like that, I think?
Hi, I'm Surin Kim with ABC News. I come from the investigative unit, but I'll be covering 2024 election cycle. Was there anything from the 2020 elections or 2016 or any other past cycles that you guys felt was important or big issues that you feel are irrelevant now?
Okay, so we only have, I want to get that last question, or we may or may not get it. So and this is the speed answer to that question with 1:18 left on the clock. And I know, see, this question deserves probably more in depth. So we are going to give the headline answer. Kaitlan, Liz, and Priscilla.
I'll say quickly, I think with the midterm elections, there was a huge anticipation of a big Republican wave that did not materialize, as we all now know. And that's why it's important not to buy into narratives that are being pushed. Make sure that you're just waiting to see what the voters decide.
Yeah, I look, again, I would sort of play off that, say anything polling, horse race related, maybe not that relevant to an investigative reporter, but that stuff, no one is going to remember that poll in a week, let alone 4 years.
Okay, Priscilla.
Yeah, I was gonna say something along similar lines, which is focus on the voters. If you're out at events and out in the field, like other people can deal with the polling and the horse race and stuff like that. I would try to listen to what voters are saying and make sure you're not missing anything.
Let me hear your question, because we are so under the gun, sir, but if you ask it fast, maybe we could give a fast answer. You know, Caitlin's in broadcast. She knows how to do things with
Yeah, we get wrapped all the time.
We're going to
12 seconds is like a
ask the
lifetime.
question, and Caitlin will dance us out.
Well, that's good, because actually I wanted to ask this directly to Kaitlan. A similar question that I asked a little bit earlier today, obviously given the real public dislike Donald Trump had for CNN, what's it like trying to get questions answered by a candidate who has a preconceived notion about your outlet? How do you get your answers?
I think the most important thing to remember is that you're a reporter and your job is to ask those questions and not get thrown off by a candidate if they dislike where you work, because your job is not to get into a feud with them or argue with Trump about CNN. My job was to ask him questions, and as long as we focused on that, maybe he would try to distract and not answer by attacking the outlet where I worked, but often if you just kept up with the question, it worked. And also with Trump himself, you know, he often railed against the media, but he also sought our validation. And I don't think there was one time that I was on Air Force One where he didn't come to the back, to the press cabin, to talk to us, off the record usually, but would come back and talk to us. So I think that's an important thing to remember, is even if they don't like where you work, your job is not to be liked. Your job is to ask questions.
And with that thought, final takeaway, if you ever kind of got to like steel yourself, especially new reporters, like, I don't know if I could do this because they may not like me, just remember your job is to ask the question. Thank you, Liz, Priscilla, and Kaitlan for joining us today.
Thank you, Lynn, for a great panel.